Hello, and welcome back to our series where we are creating a people and culture management system. This can also here be called an HCM, depending on the terminology you're using. This series is brought to you by Prairie HR Solutions. My name is Jake Finger, principal consultant here at Prairie HR Solutions, and in this video, I'd like to pick up where we left off from our last episode. And where we left off was we were wanting to control how users entered information. So let's open up our page here. Let's go to it, records, and let's just pick something like division. So depending on who's using this, if you lock this down to only HR, or you can even scale it up and open it up to say um, managers, new hires, employees, depending on how you want to work that out. And the access that you give them to be able to do certain things, you can get all kinds of things if this is just a text box. So in the division, you would have whatever they called their division. And instead of finance, they could drill it down into the unit or maybe an acronym or a nickname they gave their unit. And when we get information like that, it makes it incredibly challenging to get information back that's meaningful. And we don't just want this massive lake of data that it's just a free for all, and then we have to fish for each and every single one of them. What we want to do is control how users put information in on these certain fields. Now, obviously, last name is going to be up to them. Employee ID is pretty self-explanatory, the date, and so on. But the division, we really want to only receive the divisions that we have in our database. So we want human resources as human resources, not HR or benefits or talent acquisitions or whatever. Operations would be a big one. So we want to control it. So instead of having this as an input box, what I did in between these videos is I went through and selected each one of those that we really wanted to maintain consistency on and turned it from an input box to a drop down. And where I have this information coming from, let's go back over here to our code. So our code in these select boxes doesn't actually have it hard coded in here. I have it coming dynamically, and dynamically they are coming from our web app data page. And each one of those drop downs representing, each one of those values represents a column in this list. Now, if you remember how we did this, our initial and our secondary drop down, it's the same exact concept. So let's go back over to our main page, and essentially what I have written here is once that DOM content loads, just like with the initial drop downs, it will fire off a function that then fires this function off in our server side, and each one of these will go over and grab the range. It will find the exact length of that based on that column, and then it'll get all the values in that. And then what it will do is it will then store it in this variable, because this could get incredibly long. If you remember how we did this, we would just essentially return an individual line. Well, we have multiple lines here, so we would have to then create, essentially, if we did it the same way, we'd have to do a function for every single one of these, and that would get out of hand. So what I did instead is I turned all of these into an array. And the reason I'm having to use flat is because it's coming to us as a multi-dimensional array. So I flatten each and every single division drop down in this case into a one-dimensional array, and then I encase this whole thing into a two-dimensional. So essentially, this record DD contains a two-dimensional array full of one-dimensional arrays. Now, if you think about how we access data in our arrays, we can simply say record DD 01, or 0 would be that one would be that one, and so on. And I can use that once I pass this record DD over to our operations side. So when we come down here to our operations side, how I approached that was I passed that information from the server side and gave it a value of D, and then I simply signed new variables based on the index of those values. And then I was able to essentially go through and use that same piece that we did for each and then generate our drop downs dynamically. And I was concerned by doing it this way if it would slow it down. And I was happy to see that since we're doing it with the DOM content load, it occurs once these two are done and they're already populated. So no major performance issues there. And we can scroll all the way down here and, to our last one, dental providers, dental coverage. They happen essentially with no lag there. So I'm okay with the performance. The one thing that I'm not okay with is just how many times that we are having to repeat this same idea for each. So in the future, when I'm looking at this, you can see it just keeps going and going and going. I may condense this a little bit and I'll make a video on it. If I choose to do that, I'll make a video on how it is that I'm breaking down each one of these for eaches and creating its own. Same with our massive list of variables up here. But I mean, it is what it is. So that took care of the drop down boxes. And let's go back over here to our form here. And what I also did was I looked at our calculations. So I haven't done anything with our annual pay and then breaking it down into annual or hourly, or if it's hourly, breaking it into biweekly, monthly, annual, things like that. I haven't worked on this piece, but what I did focus on was our premium pay. So our premium pay is always times by something. And in my experience, this calculation, depending on who's doing it or how many times they've done it, this calculation can throw people into I can say just throw people into a tizzy. We can get all sorts of numbers for this payback or for this callback pay with 2 hours. It's just how people approach the calculations. So what I wanted to do was I wanted to create a method that controlled the calculations and did it the correct way. So that time and a half is for overtime. Time and a half is essentially multiplying the hourly rate and then taking that product and then multiplying it to how many hours have worked. And like I said, at times people can just come up with incredibly different calculations. And the one thing that we don't want to do is either underpay overtime or essentially overpay and then have to take something back. So what I did was I took our holiday premiums and on-call premiums, essentially all of our premiums. And in our example, we have different premiums. Perhaps in the example, they had a union agreement or whatnot, and this is what they came up with. And these are actually disabled fields. So we have the value here. We just can't change it at all. So in order to change it, we would have to go into our hard code currently right now and modify that. But what we can do is, since nobody can change this, they could type in here, and maybe what we should do is make this disabled as well. Let's go check that and see if we can. They could simply press this calc button and it calculates if there's an hourly rate. And if there's not an hourly rate, what I have produced instead is please enter a base pay. And that simply means that, well, we've got to enter a, well, let's just do $10. Yeah, I know that's probably no good for some states, but for the example, we'll do it. Now, when we hit calculate, what it will do is it will consistently calculate it in the same exact way. Take the hourly rate, multiply it by the premium, take that product and multiply it by the hours, and you'll get what the callback pay is. So I did that for each and every single one of these. And let's test if we can set this. Let's go to callback pay. Scroll up here, find our callback pay. Here we go, callback pay. And you'll see that our placeholder here is this. Let's actually change this to this disabled piece. So in Bootstrap, you can disable a input field by simply putting this here at the end, disabled. So now let's save this and see if disabled will still receive data that is being pushed to that field. So let's come in here, let's refresh this. And we used callback. And we can simply come in here and go to callback and hit, yep, good. So it sure does. But the great thing is with callback, you're not actually able to enter. Like here you can enter, but callback you can't enter. So let's go through and do that real quick. Let's just grab this disabled and put it on every pay. That way we can control essentially what is being entered when. Because you never want an FLSA overtime pay audit. You ever get one, they really don't care what happened or how it happened. There's a lot of information that you got to push out for that. Okay, so that's the premium. And then we want our pay here. Let's make sure I got the callback pay, third shift pay, and weekend pay, and we should have holiday pay. Oops. Okay, there we go. So that's good. So now we can control that. And all they have to do is enter how many hours they are and then push it. Now, how I did these calculations was instead of having this button aside, so this button I'm using in place of a span. So when you look at a calc button here, you'll notice that we have the input, which is the place where we can type or it's disabled or whatnot. And then since I wanted the button at the end of it, I would put it after the input. If I wanted it right in between the span and the input, I would put it there. But since I wanted it at the end, I put it there and I gave it a ID. Each one of the buttons, you'll notice, has an ID, a unique ID. And then in line here, I put a function on click, calc premium pay, and then I'm passing an event argument. So instead of creating a function for each and every single button, what I can do is just call a single function and then pass this event here. And then when we go down to this function, I can pull that event and then I can create another variable. And in our case, we called it calc button clicked, because what I want to know is which button actually got clicked. And to do that, I can use this event target. And you can use an event. You can use event target. You can use event source. So if you're wanting to do a series of on changes, you can find the source of that change and kind of drill down to a specific cell or field or whatnot. But in our case, we wanted to identify the target of that event, of that on click event, and then simply get the ID. And then what we can do is we can create some of our variables. We got to grab that hourly rate, and I created a variable for that error message. But then we can run an if statement to see if that ID equals something. And if it did, of course, we would check if there's any value in that OT pay, that hourly pay. And if there wasn't, we would get the error messages. But if there was, then we could run this function here and essentially assign it that premium. In fact, we can even do this a little bit more dynamically by, like I did here, I created a variable to store the value of our travel premium in this case. And then instead of passing a number, I just pass that. Because when you think about coding or creating something in a function, the one thing you always want to keep in mind is, how am I going to scale this or modify it? Because it is an inevitability that you are going to have to do either or both. And when you're thinking about that, if we were to leave it, such as this, which is fine. I don't think I've ever seen, personally anyway, overtime anything other than time and a half. But if we were to have to change our travel premium and we had like 0.075 or 0.75 here, we would not only have to change it here for the calculation, but also have to change it up here in our span or our input value as well that's disabled. Now, like I said, I do have this value here built in. I didn't do anything dynamic with it because I don't foresee this stuff changing very well. I mean, unless you're going through negotiations, if this is union based, if this amount is union based, and you're going through negotiations, yearly, I don't particularly see this changing frequently enough to be an issue, but you can easily pull this dynamically from the sheet using the codes that we already have. So this way I was able to control the calculations with an if statement. Now the drop down boxes, I know we already went through the drop down boxes, but we were able to utilize that same exact for each. And I'm sorry, I'm going off on a tangent here because this really does bother me, just how many of the same things we have. And I could create, I guess, a variable in a loop, but we'll save that for another time. So now coming back over here to our sheet, there's one other piece that I did. And the other piece that I did was I created a note section. And this note, I mean, anytime that you create a record, particularly when it deals with HR, is you want to keep a history of why that changed, because you never want to be accused of being deliberately indifferent or malicious, or the decision was arbitrary or capricious or whatnot. You always want to keep essentially everything, but you don't want to keep everything piled in a corner or a desk or something like that. So what I did was I created a record section, and this record section, individuals can just come in here and type something, and then when they created the record, this would then get populated. Now, I haven't actually done anything with this, and that's really what I want to touch on now. So if we were to run this, this would not get taken over. And the reason it's not is because I haven't told it to get that element. So you know that when we came over here and we created the dynamic way of grabbing, let me find it here, all of our inputs to push the information over to our sheet, this create record function, here we go. what we did was used query selector all, and we selected all of our inputs. So to do the select boxes, I couldn't just select it by the select tag. Let me find one here. Yeah, see, I couldn't just come in here and then let me find a select tag here real quick. Okay, so I couldn't use this tag because it would go through this whole DOM and select or find all the select tags. Well, if you remember, we also have our two categories, which are also selects. We don't want the values of those. So instead of using the select tag, what I did was I came over and assigned it a new class, and I called that class rectdd. So now instead of querying all select tags, it's going to query all rectDDs. And I left those off of our category and subcategory, so it's not going to grab these. So when we have a new field, like our note field, we can tackle this one of two ways. And since it's just one field, it really doesn't matter that much. I could go in and grab, the text area tag. I could create a new class, which I did, this rec notes, or what I could do is just use something that it's already pulling. So I think that's how I'm going to do it. I'm going to just use something that we're already pulling. So I'll assign that rectdd class here. And what that'll do is it will fall underneath this rectdd. So when you do a query select all, instead of selecting one, you can actually select multiple. And how you do that is you separate each one by a comma. And that comma, well, it separates, but if you'll notice right after that comma, I have this point, this dot. So this dot, what you're doing is you're attempting to grab either the element or select it by something. And if you know CSS, then this looks rather familiar because a dot is the class of rectdd. Tag is nothing, dot is class, and then of course, if we wanted to grab individual IDs, we would use the hashtag and then the ID. Now, since we have this rectdd class assigned also to that text area, there shouldn't be anything else that we have to do because remember, we did this all dynamically. We're not having to go in and manually get that document by ID and then get the value and then pass it to and then pass it. We did this all dynamically. So now that we included it in the rectdd, it should automatically pick it up, put it at the end, grab the ID, and then create the object of the values. And then it will send it over to our push records on our server side and pass that LIDs. So when we go over here, just a quick refresh. Quick refresh on our push record. It's automatically going to be included in this elemental ID, and it's going to map the order based on how it pulled it in the HTML. And then it should simply just push it. So let's go ahead and save this. Let's make sure we save it before we run it. And let's refresh. And records. Now, I'm not going to fill out any of these. Well, maybe I'll fill out the state. Because what's going to happen is it's still going to grab the value of this, but the value is going to be choose. And you'll see that when we populate it. So let's come down here and write new hire. And then let's create a record, process it. It went away, so we knew that it fired. And then let's go back to our sheet here, our employee data and then look at our very last one, and you'll notice choose, and then we selected one that wasn't choose. Is state, Wisconsin. There we go. And you'll notice that it took that new hired field and placed it here on the end, which is exactly where it should be. So now we can just name that column notes, and now we have a way to capture notes. So the way that we did it is incredibly helpful when we want to scale and grab information. And that also includes if we want to remove fields. If you remove a field in the HTML, however, you're going to have to remove the appropriate field here. Now, this is a modest database considering employees. So anytime you want to expand, you just expand where it needs to go in that HTML form, and then it will align here perfectly. So now what I think I'm going to want to do is, before I end this video here to get caught up, to get, this catch-up video here, I want to look at the piece that we still have outstanding. And this is the annual pay, hourly, biweekly, monthly. So the next video, I'm going to build this out, and I'll show y'all how I'm going to build this out, but I want y'all to think about what needs to happen operationally. So if we were to simply put annual in here, well, that doesn't really help for individuals who are hourly paid. Because if they're hourly paid and say they're 0.75, yes, you can guess their annual pay. Or you can simply enter hourly, and then we can put a calc button here, and then it would calculate the annual pay biweekly, monthly. And if it was salaried, then we could just enter annual, and it would, and then calculate and then break everything down. So what we can do is essentially the same thing that we did down here, just slightly different with the logic. We can put a calc button here and then a calc button here. And then depending on if they're annual or depending on if they're salaried or hourly, then we can run some logic on which button was pushed and then what gets populated where. So in the next video, that's exactly what we'll do. We will build out that logic so you can really see how we did this and hopefully put it to use in your own solution. So thank you for joining me in this episode. And until next time, please take care.